10. Disappeared by the IRA. What happened to British soldiers and civilians captured by the IRA during the Irish Revolution in the early 1900s? British military authorities eventually made serious efforts to find where the IRA buried many of the British soldiers they made disappear. The British government cooperated with the National Army and the Civic Guard to create a secret list for this category of missing soldiers. They made significant efforts to recover the missing bodies of ground forces, but they didn't send all the British-born soldiers back to England. The IRA volunteers captured British Army officer Major Lee Compton Smith. On April 28, 1921, they held him in Donoughmore, and then members of the IRA shot him and his body disappeared. In 1925, the Civic Guards located his body at Barracharing Wood, and they brought his remains back to Cork City in Ireland. Members of the Civic Guard contacted his family, and his wife asked them about the situation surrounding his death. She found out he was going to meet with a nurse in Blarney for a romantic encounter. Soon after finding this out, she got remarried and had no interest in having his remains returned home. It turned out that Compton Smith was an atheist, so instead of being buried in a Protestant cemetery, they finally laid him to rest in Fort Carlisle Graveyard, which is now Fort Davis that overlooks Cork Harbour. The British officials also found many civilians the IRA made disappear and reinterred them after receiving letters from their families. Researchers and authorities have never recovered nearly half of the victims throughout Ireland. These people remain buried in unmarked graves. This atrocity was just one of the horrible things the IRA did throughout the Irish Revolution. 9. Living POWs in Vietnam. Between 1964 and 1973, the North Vietnamese captured hundreds or possibly thousands of American soldiers. They put these POWs through horrible conditions in prisons throughout North and South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and China. Foreign governments cooperated in returning nearly 600 of them to the US at the end of the war in 1973 as part of a project called Operation Homecoming. The US government listed over 2,000 Americans as missing in Southeast Asia, including at least 135 soldiers who they knew were captives of the North Vietnamese. These numbers stood during the 90s when the US and Vietnam restored diplomatic relations. Around the same time, Russian President Boris Yeltsin said the Soviets had sent home some American POWs to Soviet prisons after the war, where they stayed in unimaginable conditions for years. Since then, a lot of people still think that US service members may still be alive in Vietnam or elsewhere. The American and Vietnamese governments both insist that this is not the case, but many veterans have claimed otherwise, along with some Vietnam-era politicians. And while US officials deny that they left any living Americans behind, enough of the people who disagree are credible sources on the matter, making the case that the government isn't being 100% truthful. 8. 71 vanished vehicles. In early 2014, 71 vehicles went missing from the South African National Defence Force (SANDF) base in the city of Polokwane, South Africa. The disappearance included many trucks, motorcycles, fuel tankers, 3 water tankers, a field kitchen, a Mamba mine-protected vehicle, a trailer filled with showers, and more. An article that appeared on the military news website DefenseWeb blamed poor administration for the vehicle's unknown whereabouts. Officials dispatched a list of the missing property to every SANDF base throughout the country, seeking details about the vehicle's locations. The disappearance came shortly after SANDF Chief General Solly Shoke called for the creation of a central database containing the registration information of every military vehicle. It would require missing vehicles to be searched for, and an explanation for those that the military couldn't find. When the media reached out for an update on the situation later that year, SANDF gave a suspiciously tight-lipped response, simply stating that the matter was still under investigation and that sharing details could jeopardize the ongoing search. 7. Missing Korean War soldiers. The violence of the Korean War came to a halt nearly 70 years ago, thanks to an armistice calling for a stop to the fighting between North and South Korea. But without a peace treaty between the countries, they are technically still at war in what's known as a frozen conflict. In 2018, the two Koreas came to an agreement allowing for excavations at the demilitarized zone in search of the remains of thousands of Americans and Korean soldiers that are still missing. The US and South Korea have both worked to recover and identify bodies, which has become much easier thanks to DNA technology. But the process is painstaking. Every year, 100,000 South Korean soldiers take part in the excavations, which take place in the DMZ's vast forests. In 2018, they identified 6 sets of American remains. Another breakthrough came the same year when North Korea turned 55 boxes of remains over to the US following a historic meeting between then-President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Between the remains inside the boxes and other remains that were repatriated during the early 90s, they've identified nearly 200 missing South Korean soldiers through the DNA of their living relatives, along with dozens of American service members. 6. 50 military vehicles. During the Gulf War in 1991, 50 US military vehicles disappeared from an American army base in Saudi Arabia. The Americans thought they'd secured the compound, yet Humvees, 5-ton trucks, and other vehicles vanished almost every night, according to senior officers who spoke with the Los Angeles Times. The disappearance of the vehicles worried US officials about the possibility of terrorists using the vehicles to pose as American soldiers and launching an attack. They didn't find any of the vehicles, even though there was an extensive US military police investigation. During the second week of the war, American commanders received intelligence reports warning of over a dozen Palestinian terrorists operating in the area, and to pay attention to suspicious-looking men driving civilian vehicles. Some officers thought that US soldiers were stealing the vehicles to make up for a shortage of vehicles and spare parts at other base camps that needed supplies. Troops also had drastic shortages of other equipment, including chemical suits and maps. Even though they suspected terrorists of stealing many of these things, officers claimed that there was enough security to protect the military against raids. The military never did solve this troubling mystery, or if they did, they never announced it to the public. What do you think happened to these vehicles? Share your thoughts in the comments. Remember to subscribe to see more mysterious videos. 5. Clara Barton Search. American nurse Clarissa Harlow Barton, better known as Clara Barton, is best known for founding the Red Cross. Throughout the Civil War, she tended to wounded soldiers on the battlefield and in hospitals. As the war came to an end in early 1865, she shifted her focus to injured Union soldiers returning home from prison camps in the South. She realized it was important to bring closure to the families of missing soldiers. After getting President Lincoln's approval, she opened an office dedicated to the task of tracking down these missing soldiers. Thousands of letters poured in from families looking for lost loved ones, amounting to 60,000 requests in just 3 years. Barton's team made 5 different rolls of missing men that were published in various newspapers across the country. Barton then traveled throughout the North, giving lectures about her experiences and telling the stories of soldiers who were captured during the war. By the time the Missing Soldiers Office closed in 1868, her team had located around 22,000 soldiers. Clara Barton went down in history as one of the POW/MIA community's first advocates, setting a precedent for future organizations, activists, and government agencies dedicated to the cause. 4. Training exercise gone wrong. 1 US Marine died, 2 were critically injured, and 8 went missing in 2020 during a nighttime training exercise off the California coast that went horribly wrong. The troops were using an amphibious assault vehicle, AAV, in the waters off San Clemente Island, just north of San Diego, when the vehicle filled with water. They signaled to the rest of the unit, and a rescue boat and 2 other vehicles immediately responded, according to Lieutenant General Joseph Osterman, who was commanding the exercise. Nearby troops watched the 26-ton vehicle go down, which probably sank hundreds of feet below the surface because of its weight. It was too deep for divers to be able to reach the bottom. Out of 8 Marines who crews rescued, 1 later died from his injuries. 7 other Marines and a sailor remain missing. They continued the search, and the Marine Corps announced it would inspect its entire fleet of over 800 AAVs to make sure they were safe. They suspended their use until they had the results of the inspection. At first, they didn't know what caused the accident, but military officials remained cautious to make sure something like this wouldn't happen again. They eventually called off the search, and officials presumed the 8 missing soldiers were dead, bringing the death toll to 9. An investigation blamed inadequate training, substandard maintenance, and poor judgment of those in charge. Following the findings, an officer was relieved of his command. Earlier this year, officials announced the officer may face charges for his alleged role in what many see as a needless and avoidable tragedy. 3. Missing World War II soldiers. The Recovery of the Fallen in Eastern Europe is a German non-profit devoted to locating the remains of World War II soldiers. Founded in 1992, the organization's mission is to permit a worthy burial of the dead of war and to return them their names. Besides finding the bodies of fallen soldiers, the group also does its best to identify the remains. World War II ended over 75 years ago, but countless soldiers remain missing. It's not surprising, considering the war's estimated military death toll of around 20 million service members. In the 3 decades since the nonprofit began its work, volunteers have carried out over 200 searches and have found the remains of over 7,700 missing soldiers. They don't search for people of any specific nationality. Speaking with Haaretz, the association's chairman, Albrecht Lau explained that this war destroyed lives and people died needlessly on all sides. By identifying as many fallen soldiers as possible, the organization brings closure to families and helps future generations understand the costs of war by treating soldiers as individuals and not treating them like a statistic. The organization also builds friendships and helps bridge the gap between people that were once bitter enemies. 2. Missing soldiers in Afghanistan. Shortly after a resurgence in the Taliban's power in 2005, a small reconnaissance team of Navy SEALs vanished in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. A Special Forces helicopter was attempting to help the soldiers in Kunar when insurgents shot it down, killing all 16 soldiers. It was a major incident involving the US military since they overthrew the Taliban in 2001. Hundreds of American and Afghan soldiers immediately began a widespread search for the missing men. Within days, they found one of them alive and in good condition. In his words, he had managed to evade the enemy. Military officials said they had no reason to believe that the enemy captured or killed the other team members. The Taliban took credit for shooting down the helicopter and also claimed to have kidnapped at least one high-ranking American military member. But the Taliban official who made these claims was known for lying and exaggerating information to the press about the killing and capture of US soldiers, so it was hard to say whether or not he was telling the truth. Within weeks of their disappearance, search teams found the 2 other missing soldiers dead. Evidence suggests at least one of them died in a shootout with the enemy, but there were no signs that they held him captive. 1. Missing troops in Iraq. One night in May 2007, insurgents captured 3 American soldiers while on duty in a region south of Baghdad, nicknamed the Triangle of Death. Private Byron Wayne Footy, Specialist Alex Ramon Jimenez, and Private First Class Joseph John Anzac Jr. were on the lookout for insurgents when a group armed with explosives and automatic weapons snatched them. The enemy killed 4 soldiers that they were on patrol with at the scene. A massive search involving over 4,000 soldiers took place. They raided buildings, went into people's homes, and even arrested many suspects. They rounded hundreds of people up during the search, and they sent a lot of them to detention facilities. 11 days later, US soldiers found Anzac Jr.'s remains in the Euphrates River with a gunshot wound to the head. At that point, the families of the 2 other men lost hope of seeing them alive ever again. A few weeks after that, the Islamic State of Iraq posted a video online claiming that they killed Jimenez and Footy after the US refused to meet their demands to stop the search. The disturbing footage showed the missing men's military ID cards and several of their personal belongings. But it wasn't until the following year that Jimenez and Footy's loved ones would finally receive the heartbreaking closure they'd waited so long for. Military officials found the soldiers' remains in the Iraqi village of Jerf in July 2008. They identified the men through dental records and flew their bodies to the US for an autopsy report. Sadly, the report showed the enemy soldiers likely tortured the pair for several months before they murdered them. Thanks for watching. Which of these mysteries do you think is most important to solve? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.